And so the question often gets thrown at us, well, you know, the founders, they were just a bunch of deists. They were a bunch of deists, or they were a bunch of atheists. We hear that too. They viewed this secular government that was separated from church and state and all that. And you start to ask yourself, well, is that really true? You know, we've been told that and we've been taught that, but is it really true? And I think it's important that we understand some definitions. For example, a theist. Well, what is a theist? How would you define a theist? You're free to interact here a little bit. Person that believes in at least one God. All right? Because you can have a monotheist, or you can have a polytheist, or a lot of other theists, but a person that believes in at least one God. Well, what's a deist? A deist is a type of theist that believes that God created the universe, that God set everything into motion with a bunch of physical principles and causes and effects and secondary causes, but now he doesn't get involved. Now he just kind of turned it loose and he lets it run on its own, and he doesn't get involved in the affairs of man anymore. The earth just kind of on autopilot. Often it's called the clockmaker theory, that God was this celestial clockmaker that just kind of wound everything up, put it in motion, now that's hands off. That's kind of a technical definition of what a deist is. And of course, we know what an atheist is, someone who does not believe in the existence of God. And when you look at the founders, oftentimes people say, well, they're just a bunch of deists. I had a Sunday school teacher at my church the other 2 or 3 weeks ago said that. He's a professor of world religions at one of our local universities, and he just kind of made a side comment that a lot of the founders were deists. And I called him on it, you know, and because I don't think the evidence supports that. But when you hear people say our founders were a bunch of deists, who are the two they always throw out at us as examples? Jefferson and Franklin, right? Those are the two big ones, and maybe Paine, but those two for sure. So let's take a look at what some of these men that are accused of being deists, that don't believe God governs in the affairs of men, let's see what they had to say about some of this stuff. And TJ is one of them here. Jefferson said, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure if we have lost the only firm basis, the foundation, which is the conviction in the hearts and minds of the people that these liberties are a gift of God? He says that in the Declaration as well, that they are not to be violated, but with his wrath. Now, folks, a deist that doesn't believe that God intervenes in the affairs of man would not be fearful of God's wrath. He wouldn't see God doing anything about it. He just kind of lets you have natural consequences, but you don't have him intervening and imposing his wrath. He went on to say, indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and his justice cannot sleep forever. The words of a deist that would abide by this clockmaker theory, I'll let you be the judge of that. Interestingly, Jefferson's talking about slavery. Jefferson, the slave owner, is talking about slavery. He recognized back then the evils of slavery, but it was so wrapped up in the life of American colonists in the early founding of the country. It was kind of tough to get loose from it, but they recognized the evil of it, and they recognized it was absolutely contrary to some of the moral principles that we were trying to establish in the founding of our nation. Then we go over to Franklin. Franklin was one of the few that were a delegate both to the Second Continental Congress, where they signed the Declaration, and the Constitutional Convention. And during the Constitutional Convention, he said this, I have lived, sir, a long time. And he had. He was like 80-something years old, 84 years old, something like that. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. This man had biblical knowledge. Now, we could argue that Jefferson and Franklin were not Christians, and they probably weren't, according to the historical record. I mean, Jefferson denied the deity of Christ. He believed that Christ's teachings were the best moral pattern that we had, the best moral system, but denied the deity of Christ. But he called himself a Christian. Franklin, likewise, perhaps was not. But look at the biblical worldview, the biblical knowledge that these men had during this time. He goes on to say, I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. The words of the deists. And these are the two that get thrown out most often. And we can look at the founders, and we can see example after example after example. They weren't deists. Most of them were evangelical Christians. The vast majority, certain exceptions, vast majority, evangelical Christians, many of them trained in the seminary. Today we call them a bunch of Bible thumpers. That's what we call them today, if they were around. So the next question becomes, well, did these Christians that had this Christian worldview, did they have this idea that church and state should somehow be separate? So